Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. Mr. Thompson, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Would you like to introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Yeah, my name's Douglas Thompson. For over 20 years, I was a correspondent in Los Angeles through the 70s and the 80s. I've written just quite a number of books now, about 35 books on a whole range of topics, mainly because mainly because there were good stories, not just people, but good people with good stories. And it's ranged a lot of it because I was, based in Hollywood. A lot of it was Hollywood biographies, and they led on to quite an eclectic bunch of other books into the underworld in America, in Hollywood, in Washington, and throughout. And obviously, because I'm originally from Scotland, and I worked in Fleet Street in London for some time before going to America as a correspondent. I've got quite a good background on politics and crime in the UK as well. That's really my sort of general interests, and but mainly, I suppose, a fascination with the movies from the early days when growing up as a kid, it really was. I think it probably still was. Black and white movies were still the thing. Color was coming in; it was a big deal, and you saw all these big stars. And of course, in the UK, and years gone by, if a film was released in America, you might not see it in Europe for 9 months, a year, maybe 2 years. So, and there was none of this hype and pre-publicity or anything. So when you saw a movie star and a picture, it was a big event. So they took I think Hollywood stars took on a far greater meaning in the golden era, if you like, than they do today, because they're on talk shows, they're on podcasts, they're on radios, they're all in your next door, and they're in the supermarket with you almost. It's hard to avoid them. So the event factor has gone. And so when I was in America, when I first started working there, you kind of felt in a way you knew some of the stars. And of course, by then, lots of these older movie stars, people had been around, even people had been around in the Mary Pickford days, were still alive. They were bright, they were still attentive, they still went to events. So you met them, you talked to them, you interviewed them, and you got a picture of Hollywood in the 30s and the 40s. And then as the longer I was there, then you get to meet people who were big stars in the 50s and so on, big stars in the 60s. So suddenly people opened up a lot more than they did, they do today. The last time I was kind of working in magazines and did a big profile piece, an interview with Tom Cruise. I think this is maybe quite a few years ago.
Oh God, you interviewed Tom Cruise? That's crazy.
I think you had to have 12 different people to sign off on a photo, 8x10 photograph of him. Whereas you're interviewing Lloyd Bridges, he's taking your tape recorder and you're walking along the beach, or Yvonne De Carlo is asking for another martini, or I spent the day with Angie Dickinson at home. It was all that kind of. Hollywood was much more open. I'm not saying you were friends with the stars, but they were welcoming, and they got on with it, and they were polite and so on. Whereas it's much more of a machine today. It was much more social, I think, the media concern. so that led to a lot of interest in, say Angie Dickinson, for instance, in her house. There's a picture of her sitting there on her corner table and a picture of JFK in the background. And you think, oh, there and you asked about JFK and so on, and she was always very, what's the word, diplomatic about her relationship with Kennedy, as she was with a relationship with Sinatra, and so on. So but you start putting all these pieces together over the years, and you end up with a sort of much more transparent picture of what was really going on. Because there's a great story in the book I did with Mike Rothmiller on Bombshell on Marilyn Monroe, of Kennedy, JFK going to party at the beach with Peter Lawford's home, just along from Santa Monica, on the beach there at his beach house. And the next thing, Kennedy's leaped over a fence and is vanishing up Pacific Coast Highway with the blonde. And of course, the blonde is Angie Dickinson. So it's there's kind of lots of stories, little stories like that, and they all add up to a kind of, behavior of or a picture of Kennedy and the Kennedy administration at that time. And then you kind of slow off from that into the Kennedy association with the Los Angeles Police Department and Bill Parker, who was the chief of police. And everybody owed favors to everybody else. Everybody was looking after everybody else's back. And everybody hated J. Edgar Hoover. So that's, so they had one enemy in chief, or in common, and that kind of bonded them together.
Well, see, I'm relatively new on this, even with talking about all the JFK researchers and looking into Kennedy's policies. Nobody ever mentions the amount of affairs that Kennedy had. It's kind of like a taboo subject amongst people that are fans or people that are just interested in the history of JFK. They don't ever really talk about any of the scandals that happened. So I know your book with Bobby Kennedy and Marilyn Monroe, and I mean, I've looked into it briefly. I haven't really understood the full subject of this, but you mentioned about JFK, with this blonde walking down the street. Was this why he was president, or was this before? Was this after? Was this during? Where's the Secret Service? Why is he walking with a blonde up the street?
Yeah, well, I mean, there was there's a better one, because the Kennedys were looked after by, and I can't remember whether he's either I can't remember whether he's a senator or whether he's actually president at this point. But whatever, they are there's a Praetorian Guard there from the LAPD who looked after the Kennedys when they're in Hollywood or in Los Angeles. He's also traveling with he must have been president. He's traveling with a Secret Service team. The LAPD is also their office, criminal investigation division, sort of secret. They're spies, really. LAPD spies are also keeping tabs on Kennedy, President Kennedy. They see him leave the hotel and vanish. They ring the secret police people, the Secret Service, and say, "Do you know where your president is?" And they say, "Yeah, he's in room 345 or whatever it is in the hotel." They said, "No, he's at Kim Novak's house. He went over the wall and went off to see the actress Kim Novak." And that's all in the LAPD files as they were monitoring him. So all of that was going on. I mean, he was an atrocious philanderer. And of course, all of these secrets, be it the Secret Service, be it police authorities, his relatives, his friends, everyone pretty much kept a cap on it for many years. I think it's only in it's been well known for many years, but I think it's only in the last 10, 20 years that it's more and more detail has come out. And people are much more willing to, because it becomes more historical when it's so close to you, and when it's, say, your parents admired Kennedy or had a picture of him or something. it's harder to talk about it. But I think now, as time's gone on, um, it's a bit like talking about Teddy Roosevelt or talking about, Lincoln or whoever. All their human foibles, not quite as taboo as they were.
I think a lot of it had to be not tarnishing the reputation of someone, especially someone that was taken way too early, which is Kennedy. But I mean, it's the whole family as well, too. I wouldn't say it's a conspiracy theory, but it gets brought up of like, why is Robert Kennedy or the whole Kennedy family kind of silent on a lot of the investigation stuff when it comes into getting documents? And I think Robert Kennedy Jr. is the only one that really speaks out about it. And people always mention, well, look at what happened to Robert Kennedy. Look what happened to JFK. And I mean, I look at it like Hoover in particular. I mean, keeping it secret to not tarnish a reputation, but also Hoover. I mean, he had blackmail on everybody. And I think that was a big thing to keep him in a position. I mean, Kennedy wanted him to retire, and then there's always ideas and there's documentation to show that Hoover was blackmailing the Kennedys and knew about all of his extra affairs. But that's also why the Secret Service didn't really like Kennedy that much either. I mean, they didn't like Johnson for the same exact thing. And that's historically documented, is that they knew about his affairs, and most of the people in the Secret Service were like hardcore, I wouldn't say right wing, but they were married. They didn't believe in affairs, they didn't do any, whether they did it or not. But there was a kind of a looking down towards Kennedy for his extracurricular activities or his things he was doing with other women.
Because there was a kind of, a Christian morality.
Still there today.
That is still there. I mean, it's part of them. It's a part of the it's a part of the makeup in the West, but certainly in America, the American that value system is very much there. And of course, when you look at the FBI, CIA, secret, the agents are that stereotype. They do look like that stereotype we're used to from, the old FBI shows on TV and Dragnet and all of that. They're very clean cut people, short back and sides haircuts.
Always a fedora. Always a fedora.
Yeah, well, and no longer cigarettes though, which was always something to, But there you are. You can't have everything. But it's I mean, it's changed since sort of Raymond Chandler days of LA, but the kind of the story, the atmosphere, and the kind of geography may have changed a bit. And well, not so much the geography, but more the landscape has changed. But the stories haven't changed. It's still greed, corruption, power, people wanting to be at the top, climbing over other people to get there. And say in the case of Hoover, having what the Russians call compromat, lots of bewildering and compromising material. And if go back to Kennedy again, and Trafficante family in Tampa, when Kennedy as a senator went to Cuba in the 50s, and I can't recall exactly what date, but he was there on an official trip, and he was set up with a woman in a hotel, and Santos Trafficante said the biggest mistake he made in his whole career as a mafia man was that he failed to get the picture which they were trying to take of Kennedy, Senator Kennedy, with this hooker in Havana. So all of that kind of stuff, they knew the value of compromising him. And also in the Frank Sinatra book, The Mafia Murders, get into all of that and the situation between Joe Kennedy, the patriarch of the Kennedy family, and his relationship with the mafia, which led to, when you get the situation where you've got JFK and you've got Sam Giancana sharing the same girlfriend, and Frank Sinatra having discussions with Giancana about what the Kennedys want in help to get John Kennedy elected. And you've got Joe Kennedy playing golf with Sinatra, giving his demands, Sam Giancana turning up on the same golf course so they can't be heard. So there's deals within deals. at all the time. So, and the argument is that the either JFK stole the '60 election or it was bought for him by the mob, that the Kennedys then, when they went into the White House, especially Robert Kennedy as Attorney General, did not follow through with their promises to go easy, basically.
Yeah, he went after him like a mad dog.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it was like going into the jungle with a machete, really. That's what he did. And of course, it was against all the kind of rules that they'd, or not rules, all these conditions. And of course, the one thing with the mafia, well, with any hoodlums, gangsters, that underworld, it's a different society. They live in a different world. If we pay a bill today, we wait for the bureaucracy, the paperwork, the bank to actually transfer the money. I mean, nobody likes to pay a bill, but my God, they make it more difficult by the day. It's just that simple transfer cannot happen. Whereas in gangland terms, if you make a deal, you shake hands on it, and they hand you the $100, or they hand you the election, or they hand you whatever. But whatever arrangement is made, you keep to it. It's an honourable thing. So that dishonor of them by the Kennedys led to, it's 90% arguable that led to the death of Kennedy, and later on to all kinds of upsets in the American system. I don't think you have to be a mad conspiracist now not to think that Lee Harvey Oswald was set up in some way by
There's two sets of forces that
other
set up.
elements, you know.
There's two sets of forces that would have set up Lee Harvey Oswald. I know people like they always try and look for one particular person that was like, I think that's Alan Dulles' quote, is that every assassination besides Lincoln that's been done through history has been done with a lone nut. And that was like quoted to the Warren Commission. So it was interesting. And those are obviously not words that are based in evidence that you can use in court or anything. But you got to separate when it comes to the assassination, you separate the people who did it and then the people who covered it up. They necessarily don't have to be the same exact people. And there's plenty of evidence to show that those investigations, the Warren Commission and the HSCA, and I've spoken to Blakey from the HSCA on my show before, that he didn't feel like the CIA gave him all the documentation they needed. So whether it was manipulation of evidence or making certain things fit that ended up being exposed later, those are just the people who did it are different than the people that covered it up. But you mentioned something, and this is an interesting thing, which is about the whole thing about with Frank Sinatra. I mean, the Rat Pack and all this gang involvement. Do you think that it was, the whole Kennedy got, or the mob got Kennedy the job, or got Kennedy won the election? Or do you think it's like, just like how you mentioned in the beginning with like actors having a kind of a different level of fame than maybe they do now, because there's so much of an ease and access when it comes to podcasts and it comes to other exclusive interviews that you can literally do it from your house, like how we're doing right now. But back in the day, like if you hung out with Frank Sinatra, if you hung out with Marilyn Monroe, and necessarily the Marilyn Monroe thing might be different because it was more of a sexual thing. But I mean, I have pictures of Frank Sinatra and Kennedy, and you're wondering, what is this going on? Like you can't really say that the mob didn't get Kennedy elected. It has a lot more weight into that because of Frank Sinatra and Kennedy hanging out. We know Frank Sinatra's mob connections, whether it was the mob controlling him and getting him to sing at his club. And this is an interesting thing, which is just the fame. I mean, if you're the president, you can easily sit down with an actor because at that level, you have all the power to control whatever you want. If you want to go get Frank Sinatra at a bar or something like that, you can. But also the impact of how big those actors were back then. I mean, it's a different level of fame. We look at examples today like Tom Cruise, or we look at examples like The Rock. That didn't even compare to Frank Sinatra. I mean, I have a song that's not even attributed to him, but it is his song. And it's Frank Sinatra singing High Hopes about Kennedy. And it was never officially labeled as Frank Sinatra's song. So it's in public domain. Anybody can use it. But you hear it and you go, that's Frank Sinatra. There's no mistaking that voice. And it's talking about getting Kennedy elected. And you're like, did Kennedy, I mean, was Frank Sinatra a big politics guy? I didn't really hear any stories about Frank Sinatra being a politics guy, so it adds to the weight to the discussion of the mob getting Kennedy elected. I mean, there's no way in certain states, I think it was Chicago and other things like that, where there was Sam Giancana, Traficante's locations, where the overall vote for Kennedy was like, I mean, it was 100 to 1 basically.
Yeah, no, they pay. I can't remember. I think there was bags of money, of cash. I think $400,000 in $1960, which is I don't know how many millions now. But they they were going out with it. I mean, they were paying. It's paying people to vote. Simple as that. I mean, it was just bribery. Here's your $5. Go and vote here. They certainly got the vote out. It would have been a lot narrower, I think. And may not. It's and like the problem you've got is you haven't got the. If you were at the counts and you could see, if we'd had today's technology and you had a video of the count and you saw what was going on, and again, it's in out of the way towns, and sort of townships that were where the votes were going on. So it's small, but each pocket adds up to tens of thousands of votes eventually, which swing it for Kennedy. I think Sinatra very much saw himself as something of a kingmaker because he had the relationship with Peter Lawford, who was the son-in-law of JFK, brother-in-law of JFK, son-in-law of Joe Kennedy, that whole Kennedy clan. I think Sinatra saw that, he's a big, massive Hollywood star, he's this, he's that, but he didn't have that kind of status, social status, which the White House, the Camelot of Kennedy, could give him, which is what attracted lots and lots of these people around the Kennedys. It's if you look at the Bill Clinton, the support from Hollywood there, from Streisand and all the names of that term, that democratic influence, that whole Hollywood thing, they can swing. In America, there's always been that thing where you can swing the West Coast and the East Coast. It's the great voting public in the middle who actually are the ones that matter, that don't get such a big fanfare, but actually are the ones that if the clever politics or political groups go after, because that's where you win. You might get headlines with the big names, but the vote comes in the Illinois of the world or in America, and that's certainly what happened in 1960. But it goes back though, because if you go into Hollywood in the 30s, when the Chicago mob started to move in, and their influence was immediately in the production side with the Teamsters, the unions, and they're running the unions. And that's pre-war, they're in there. And then after the war, or during the war, when you had you had the communist thing, you had I've got a book here about the Nazis in Los Angeles. They had a whole place on Wilshire Boulevard. So a lot going on because everybody saw the propaganda value of being popular in Hollywood. It's sold tickets. In this case, it sells. They're looking for it to sell them votes or give them votes. So it's a real. Again, if you go back even further. You go back to 1916, First World War. William Randolph Hearst is making movies. They make them out, I think, he starts making them out in New Jersey, somewhere in New Jersey in 1910 and so on. And you've got people like Stan Laurel of Laurel and Hardy is making films. And then, then they move west. And Hearst was making films, patriotic movies, in which the Yellow Peril were a big, were the villains. And you had, you never see it today, of course, but you'd had actors made up to look Oriental, you had, and they were always the really bad guys, and you had the patriotic Captain America type heroes fighting then, and that's all there. Remember, Hearst is the guy that starts the Spanish-American War to make headlines. So yeah, it's all it's not new in history, any of it. Um,
Was it
but
weird for you noticing so much of these connections with like Hollywood, with or with the mafia, with the government? Like to me, it's so mind blowing. I mean, we look at our actors like, oh my God, they must have had a rough childhood and then they had to go chase down their dreams. And it's like, oh, it didn't just stop there. There was mob influences, there was government influences. God forbid you had any communist, what would seem as communist leanings, or if you just made a bad drunk speech one night and the government decided they wanted to label you a communist, you were kind of screwed. But then there was like so much influence into the Hollywood industry where I was like, damn, my dreams of wanting to be an actor would have been gone right in the beginning, man. That was one of the most hardest things, which really gives you a lot of credit to a lot of these people that maintained whichever way they possibly could, their stardom in a sense. But I mean, we talk about stars going insane today. Back then, I'm surprised everyone handled it together so well. No wonder everybody had a picture with like a martini glass in their hand or a scotch.
yeah, yeah. I mean, what was it? What was that? There was a line somewhere. I mean, then how do you survive in Hollywood? Bourbon. but yeah, I mean, when you see people kind of crying about the level of stress they have today, but you look at the things like, I mean, it's tragic when you think someone like Rock Hudson hiding the sexuality for decades, but not so much his personal kind of covering up or hiding his own uh, sexuality, but the fact that the fear that he must have had throughout his life of being exposed. I mean, the pressure of that must have been horrendous. Because suddenly you're Doris Day's leading man, and if in the 1950s and 1960s they said, you're gay, and it was published, it would have been a end of career, who knows? I mean, it was certainly in the UK. I mean, homosexuality was illegal till
I
'67.
mean, look at J. Edgar Hoover. He was hunting down communists, hunting down homosexuals, hunting down all that. And then I have photos of him in a dress. I didn't think it were real. And then I see him and I'm like, wow, this guy is a hypocrite.
Yeah, but he was smoking a cigar in the dress, wasn't he?
This one is just him walking with Clyde Tolson. Now, look, I can't even verify that that's like 100% real. But what I can tell you is
No, I mean, the thing is, the
hold
problem
on.
with things like that, with the Hoover picture, once it's been said, and an image of some sort has been shown, it can't be unsaid or unseen. That's the problem, and it's very hard to. I tell you,
Well, hold on. I found Clyde Tolson's employee, like his, I guess what, performance report, and Hoover signed it all, everyone that was involved in the FBI. Clyde Tolson is the only one who got an excellent rating. So whether you want to say that that's suspicious or not, but I mean, there's words in there you could easily pull out and make it really into the relationship type thing where he was like, was very attentive to my needs. And I'm like, I haven't seen this on any other FBI report to any other employee, was very attentive to my needs. And that is specifically like just blurts out at you where I go, dude, you could run with that if you wanted to.
yeah, yeah. No, it's true. No, but I was going to say when when Margaret Thatcher was the British Prime Minister, and very close with Reagan and the whole thing, and I was this must have been the '80s, but I was working for a newspaper here. The story came out, was floated, never typical Variety or Hollywood Reporter story, planted there that they were going to make a film of Margaret Thatcher's life. So the story is reported in London, and they named the film company. And I called up the film company, and they said, "No, we're trying, but it's way down the line, and we're doing 3 or 4 other things." And I talked to London, and I said, "No, it's not a flyer. It's not going to happen." Oh, it's got to happen. We've now cast the film. We've got the whole Margaret Thatcher's been. We've named an actress to play her. We've named an actor to play the deputy prime minister, an actor to play the home secretary, the chancellor of the exchequer. So the stories. So by then, it had taken on a life of its own, and even the serious, top of the line newspapers in the UK were writing leaders, editorial pieces on their main pages about the Margaret Thatcher movie, which was never going to happen. Well, it did. There was a movie 30 years later, but the point being that when something starts, sometimes it's too good. It's a bit like John Ford and The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, isn't it? You print the legend, whether it's true or not. So there's a lot, and that's the difficulty when you look into a lot of the mainstream material available on Kennedy, Sinatra, the Marilyn Monroes, and so on. What's lovely, and I'm working with this Mike Rothmiller, who used to work for the LAPD, is his connections. And one of his former colleagues, his father, worked with LAPD in the 50s and 60s, but I think this happened in the 50s when they had to serve a subpoena on Sinatra and for a fight, punch up at a nightclub, something like that. But they had to fight a subpoena on him. And nobody would say where Sinatra was. They got a tip where he was, and he was in Palm Springs. And they went to Palm Springs, got into the to the home, and found a woman there, asked where Sinatra was. They said he's in this other room. Went into the room, and he was out of it, 3 o'clock in the morning or something. There was a guy in the bed. They filed the subpoena, and there's all the detail about the guy's teeth being in a tumbler by the side of the bed, and so all of this stuff. This kind of disheveled character, who at that point is one of the great stars of all time. And that kind of detail comes out 50 or 60 years later through word of mouth, through characters who were told it by the father and so on. So it's in today's world, it's really a question of perseverance, just keeping, waiting to hear or to find people like that who were present when things happen, because so much of what was reported at the time is even being wiped out because everything's being digitalized. But somebody sets up, somebody at some point has a cutoff date, and you can't really research newspapers and so on from little small towns. It's the small town police forces. We found you could go there and look at their records. There's an incident of Sinatra and Ava Gardner shooting up a place just outside Palm Springs, and it was all covered up. Cops were paid off. Everything was smoothed away, except the small town police had kept a record of the incident. Going back.
Is that because the respect for Sinatra that the police department had for him? Like, because I feel like even if you give anybody that type of leniency or let them kind of act however they want, whether they're connected or not, it's dangerous because it only keeps accepting that behavior to where you feel like you're above the law.
Yeah, very much. There's an element of that, but I think they probably had more respect for the dollar bills that they were getting as well, and on an equal. Having said that, I think you could be right in that the people are starstruck, and the chief of police can be as starstruck as as somebody else. So there is, you're right. It's every possibility. I don't suppose the dollars harmed anything, but maybe I would have thought how it would have been done would let us play for the damage, let us do this, let us do that. That's how it would have been handled, I would think. No, and no, but I agree. I think these people are put on a pedestal, and it's very hard to get knocked off it. But the interesting thing about Hollywood has always been that They can be up there, they can be knocked off, and then the sympathy comes in for something else that happens because they, be it drink, be it drugs, be it um, disability, be it um, uh, tragedy in the family. If people come back from any of these things that might knock them out forever, there is a great deal of latitude given along with the sympathy, I think.
There's a big
And you look
issue
at
when, yeah, I'll even ask like your personal, this is more of a personal kind of perspective question, but do you think Hollywood's really changed? I mean, do you think it's kind of, I mean, in ways that obviously the technology and things of that sort of changed, but when it comes to scandals, I mean, if you look back then or what we start finding out 50, 60 years later, whether it was buried somewhere and it finally just comes to light, I mean, ours is just more immediate on actors, whether they have a drug issue or something of that. I'm like, back then there was a giant amount of displaying an image, and I think with the organized or just the mafia involved in Hollywood and also the government involved in Hollywood, there was a large amount of burying anything that could tarnish a person's reputation once you found their man. I mean, there's even theories out there, and this is from Sammy the Bull, if you know who he is, but he has his own podcast and he talked about how the mob got Steven Seagal back into making movies for them. And it's like you hear something like that, you're like, wait, what? And it's like, so all the movies that I appreciate are actually like mob made films. And it was like, yeah, it was like once you start realizing everyone has their hands in something, whether you're an actor that's being used as like a tool for a certain nefarious or reputational gain, you start realizing the benefits that do come with that. And that is if you get into trouble, if there is something that happens, somebody's probably going to bury that story to make sure that they can still use you for the things that you were implemented in the first place to be used for.
yeah, but I mean, I think that at one point in the 70s, Paramount was owned by the mafia for a couple of days because at the time of the mafia, the Vatican Bank and all kinds of, and Charlie Bluehorn in New York, I think there was all kinds of nefarious things going on. And because of the paperwork shuffling and the monies and things, I think the mob had the biggest stake in Paramount for a certain, 48-hour period or something like that until it kind of came back. They all, so it's to say that it's the old it's the Chicago way, isn't it? And it's this whole story about Chicago when there's a bus crash, there's 50 people jump on the bus, to try and bring a lawsuit. The thing with the mafia and the mob has always been to follow where the money is. And if you've suddenly got a $200 million budget for a film, obviously there's profits to be made. But equally, it's strange too in that you go back to The Godfather, another mafia film, but The Godfather particularly, the mob themselves started speaking like the dialogue of the Godfather. I mean, they did a deal whereby the word mafia could not be mentioned in the film or any of the films, and they would back off and let them film in New York without any union problems. But again, it's an image thing. It's, as you said, about everybody wearing a fedora. The FBI. It's like the mobsters feel they have to have a cigar or a bit of silver at the side of their hair and
Or
whatever.
a ring on the
And
finger.
yeah, yes. What is it with fat people who have rings on their fingers? I never figure that out.
Did you ever see that movie with the guy who played like Uncle Vinny, where he was trying out? It was a skit or something on Saturday Night Live, but he was picking out a suit, and he goes, let me try something real quick, and he turns to the mirror, and he's like, "You talking to me? You talk?" And he's testing out like the ring on his finger, and then he'll start flipping money and show how like the ring on his finger is showing every time he's flipping the money, and he's like, "Are you done?" And he goes, "No, not yet." And then he's doing a cigar and making sure his pinky is showing the ring, and so that's a stereotype out there. To me, I'm surprised that the mob never really focused on making their image more solidified as a good force. Like this was something to me which was very shocking was when I looked at, like every movie you see with cops and the mob's usually the bad guys, the renegades, the vigilante types, and the government's always the good people. Well, a lot of that was Hoover's creation of that as well too. But what was surprising to me was finding out that there was a relationship between the government and the mob, organized crime used to trying to assassinate Castro. And that's Giancana, that's Rosselli, that's Trafficante. And I just went, wait, so the good, forces, the government is working with the bad forces, and you start realizing that like there's not a difference between the government and the mob and the tactics that they use. And to me, if you look at the assassination plots are working with the government for the mob's reasons to do so, you now have leverage over the government. So you can expose that and it could blow the roof off everybody's idea of what a government is. I mean, I think everyone back then thought the government would never even get down to the same level as the mob. They were the forces of good. And then we've learned a lot more now, which I think, that gets even depicted in movies now today. There's always a cop that has some type of problem, or there's some type of not a solidified, like, Christian holistic structure about the government anymore. It's more like, yeah, but they bend a little bit. Sometimes the law has to go a little bit outside the realms of where they can really reach. And it's more realistic now.
But the thing, I mean, it's again, I suppose it's the argument about the greater good. It's like Lucky Luciano helping the government. He got his deal and got out of prison during the war because he helped them police the docks in New York and the shipping and things so on because of his connections. And you think, well, that's it's a world war and he's helping the war effort, so fine. But then you go along a little bit and you think, hang on a minute, this is to assassinate a foreign leader. I mean, remember the Kennedys are also knocking off the president of Vietnam and other people as well. So they kind of there's this kind of license to kill that they appear to have no. When you I try this, I knew. Oh gosh, there's a really good Kennedy book out a year, 2 years ago, just up to 1956, I think it goes. But there's a lot of background there, and in the family, and it's interesting the psychology of it, and that the of being right, of being on the side of right and being right no matter what, and so whatever the actions taken are justified by the result, which is they deign to be the correct result. It's
How do you get away with locking up a mob guy, though? That's even with Lucky Luciano and even Trafficante. Trafficante was locked up by Castro. And I would support that there was more weight to show that Trafficante was working both sides. Only if you look at it from a strategic standpoint, where Castro kicked out the government and the mob, and then there were 634 assassination plots on Castro, and not a single one worked. Where even the CIA, through documentation, was like, is one of the people from organized crime or someone in our government working with Castro? How is this? And the whole reason of using the mob was so that there was no connection to the government. And it was kind of like this workaround. So nothing got blamed on the US government or they'd go to war. But Trafficante got locked up. And I go, if Trafficante struck a deal with Castro where he could get himself and his mob family into Cuba and everyone else is kicked out, it makes a lot of strategic business sense. But I go to the mob, locking up a mob figure, that's a burn it bridge. There is no forgiveness, whether it's for looks or anything like that. You just damage that guy's reputation. It's like even with Rosselli. I mean, Rosselli died by being chopped up in a barrel. And I don't see the government doing something like that. That's definitely a mob hit. But what is interesting is Rosselli's testimony, where nobody took it at face value, but he said some stuff, and through documentation that we know now after all these years, he said some things that were true. But you're now a mob guy that just gave a bunch of information to the government, so you snitched, you're a rat. And then you see his death of being chopped up in a barrel makes a lot of sense. So there's that mob mentality where I go, Trafficante was locked up, then he was released. I don't see the double agent aspect, because you don't lock up a mob figure. There's no way that they're going to forgive you. But then you have Lucky Luciano. He gets taken out of prison and then helps out during World War. So it's like, did he ever really forgive, or is it that mob mentality is just on certain occasions?
Well, I think with Luciano, he didn't have any choice. I mean, he was, he's thrown out of the country anyway. Um, the it's funny because the kind of tentacles of all of this go everywhere.
I know it can make him go insane. I could tell you that much.
So, yeah, there's
I have to pop a Xanax every time I look at a government document.
no, but there's a guy called Mark Sykes who's died last year. Late 70s he was. He was an English baronet, but he was a real Mark was somebody who would steal from anybody. He was a gambler. He was all kinds of stuff. Quite a character. And I think must have been in the 60s. He was interested in buying a dog track or a racetrack. I think it was a dog track or a racetrack, something like that, in Milan. And he said that he was told there was another bidder for it. And oh no, old boy, no, don't, just take my money. Don't worry about it. And he said, who is this other person? They said, oh, it's a Mr. Luciano. He said, oh, he can have it. He can have it. And dropped straight out. And lucky Luciano took the dog track. And so they never stopped. I mean, I think that's it's like cowboys dying with their boots on. It's the same thing with the mob. They cannot resist a deal, and carry, and the risks that go with it. But but Johnny Roselli was a intriguing character. I've got his business card here somewhere on the desk.
What, dude? That's crazy.
Which he's what is it? Tactics. It's something like tactics supervisor or tactics something or other is his just job description. He there's a guy who played all. I mean, he was the ladies' man. He dated all these Hollywood stars. He ran kind of Vegas for the mob. He looked after Sinatra at certain times in Vegas. And I mean, he started out as a kind of very much a knife man in, I think New York. I think he was in Hell's Kitchen in New York. But an amazing, colorful character, handsome Johnny. But again, he made the mistake, as you say, of he talks whatever he said. He went in front of a government commission and talked. And he's having a happy retirement, supposed retirement in Florida. He plays golf every day, same course every day. And as you say, suddenly his body's found chopped up in a oil can in the bay, in the water. But again, Sam Giancana,
Shot to death in his apartment.
Yeah, but he was being lined up to speak to the commission. I think he was due to speak 4 or 5 days after he was shot in his apartment by, can't remember, there was 2 brothers, but a brother one of a mobster from Chicago, who was a friend of it, a friend in quotes, worked with him in the mob, who turned up and shot him. And then after that, there were 3 or 4 bodies suddenly found all over different places across America, who were all associated with that same people. So there was a big cleanup. Giancana was murdered to shut him up. And then there's a cleanup of the people who actually did the killing. So it's
who do you think orchestrated
that? It would drive you mad if you try to have a jigsaw of all this and put it together in a day. You would be insane by the day because all the bits have to get in the bits to fit.
Who do you think orchestrated that? Like, because the Roselli thing is not a CIA. Like, this is going to be a side question, but it's the number of suspicious deaths that happened that were linked to the Kennedy thing. Now, I think there's an estimated 150 something. Now, I've looked into, and I can probably verify that our really suspicious is probably around 50. Someone having a brain hemorrhage, and then it says no autopsy was performed, where I'm like, how the hell would you know he got a brain hemorrhage if there was no autopsy performed? But there's, and this one's, it gets commonly mentioned, but there was 4 throat chops where I swear 4 people. One is a very popular one that everyone knows about is Jim Cothey, who was in Jack Ruby's apartment the night of him shooting Oswald. And he was apparently writing the book on the assassination. And his official cause of death was when he was stepping out of a shower, someone hit him with a chop to the back of the neck. And I think it did something. It cut off some type of circulation to his brain. They went into more specific details, but Giancana was his house was wiretapped and he was shot to death. Now the 2 brothers that did the killing, and then they were eventually cleaned up later. I mean, is that everyone suspects in documentation that I've looked at for the Kennedy assassination that it was Trafficante that did those types of things. But I've spoken to people who've interviewed like Trafficante's family and things of that sort, and they don't believe that at all. They think Roselli is probably a Trafficante issue, but the Giancana one, the shot to death thing, they just wouldn't do it that way. There's more about sending a message with the mob than there was about, doing it accurately or cleaning it up, especially if they're just testifying. I mean, Giancana could have just did nothing during the whole testimony thing.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, there is this kind of, and it would appear to be mythical thing of a kind of Mr. Big or a Mr. Big organization that was kind of pulling all the strings at the time. And of course, that all comes back into the kind of CIA, bringing the CIA in, the CIA conspiracy, and then you link them in with the CIA and with the mob, and that you then spin off into Howard Hughes and Robert Matow and the influence they had, and I mean, Hughes and the government, and Hughes. I saw a document not that long ago that had Hughes, one of Hughes' ships being deployed to pick up a nuclear, to recapture or re-get nuclear things that were lost in the Atlantic, and that was in whenever that would have been the 50s, I suppose. So you don't know, because he had the money. I mean, again, it's just all that money and all that literally kit, that the airplanes, the shipping, to have a great big influence. So if he wanted people rubbed out, they would be too. So I mean, Hughes is linked into Robert Mata, who was a former CIA agent, who also had mob connections.
It's difficult. It's very difficult.
Yeah, the thing is, I think the only way to make sense of it is to take each specific case and go with it. But of course, when you do that, be it the Kennedy or any event, if you like, if you want to call it that, there's so many spin-offs because all the characters involved have got such colorful and connected backgrounds.
I've spoken with like David Scheim, who wrote Contract on America, about like the Jack Ruby and the mob connection and the Kennedy killing. Blakey, obviously, when I spoke to him, he believes it's mob. I'm not worried about who did it. Like I don't want, the horse has been beaten for past 60 years about who did it. Everyone's got different ideas of who. What I find is interesting is exposing things that sound conspiratorial, but they're actually true, which is the mob working with the government. I mean, the cutouts. I mean, Trafficante was visited in Castro's jail by Jack Ruby. And at the time, nobody suspected that Jack Ruby was anything more than a strip club owner with low-level mob connections. But he has a bunch of different, I guess, access to certain higher-up mob figures that a low-level guy just wouldn't have. And one of the things was the gun running through Cuba. I mean, that was a question that was brought up during the church committee about Jack Ruby being an FBI informant. And it's proven that he was doing some gun running, trying to assassinate Castro. Whether he was actually initially, I mean, I think Giancana is the one that's linked most through documentation. about plots to kill Castro. He's the one that was delivered poison pills, and he never delivered those poison pills to Castro. I think there was a change or something like that. They had an inside guy, and they never did that. But there's certain attempts on Castro's life, like poisoning a swimming suit and having it was a type of chemical that would make Castro's skin start coming off. And you're like, there's no way a mob, unless Sam Giancana had an IQ of 400 or something like that, there's no way he's thinking that up. I'm thinking gun, shoot Castro, and have a fall guy that gets shot in the process. But there was a bunch of an exploding seashell. Dude, I would have been dead on assassination attempt 1. There was so many where I was like, I'm not checking a seashell for a C4.
No, I mean, you'd have to think if the amount of supposed attempts on Castro's life, that they must have one sharpshooter who just go and boom, and that would be it. I mean, it just, you guy was walking. It's a bit like the movies, isn't it? When the Tom Cruise character is running away, and you've got an army, every one of them firing, 1,000 bullets a second, and not one of them hits him. You think, God, just get one guy, get a pair of glasses. It's very difficult, but you wonder the politics. I think you come back to the politics of it too. What were the politics of the Castro thing and the saving face, and then of course you get in the Bay of Pigs, and you get into who was pulling strings and all of that. But throughout it, I think what you have to accept, the conspiracy theory, that it's not a conspiracy theory, is that the mob has been a major player in the public life of America since the 1930s, be it in local politics, town halls, all the way up to the White House. And certainly Vegas was a mob town for many, many years. I mean, I forget the number of, I think half a dozen various acts, Las Vegas Strip, big name acts, are all basically doing their turns there, doing their weeks or 3 weeks or 6 weeks, sometimes months, and not getting paid, because all they were doing was paying off the gambling debts. So I mean, it's an ongoing thing. What you see is it's a bit like the magic acts in Vegas. Just a lot of illusion going on as to what's reality.
Did you ever question why Hoover never acknowledged the mob?
You were going to tell me he's the Godfather?
No. I always,
No, I know what you mean.
Yeah.
No, but he insisted the mafia did not exist until he never would acknowledge it, never would, and said no, there is no such thing as organized crime in my America, and it was all around him. Is it Is it a kind of self-delusion on his part because if his FBI was working, there wouldn't be a mob. But the interesting thing, if you throw it the other way around, of course, is Hoover and the FBI he ran wouldn't really have existed the way it did without the mob. I mean, they were the main adversaries throughout. But I think there's got to be there's a need too, I think, and it's not really been done that thoroughly, as far as I can see, of looking into not forgetting the mob, but putting to one side the mob influence and investigating corporations and political organizations and what groups that they had operating with, compromat or blackmail or an influence as well. Because that, and that's grown. I think that's much more 21st century now, that people can destroy overnight through social media politicians, business leaders, activists, anyone in the public. If you put your head above the parapet too far, people don't like it. and you've got anything at all that they can go after, you can be shot down. Yeah, as I say, overnight, or if not overnight, almost immediately. So it's a tricky world there. But I don't know whether, with the modern mafias today is far more corporate, far more organized. But they're still dealing in the same commodities. And one of them, and obviously their biggest weapon is fear. And fear can be either through violence or it can be what they know and what they've found out.
That could have went on a different track if you look at like after the Great Depression, or during the Great Depression, you had Al Capone serving soup to people. Like that was something that for I think even the government recognized like, look, he's not doing it out of the kindness of his heart, but I mean, that could have been a different direction. Instead of ruling of fear, could you have been ruling by praise? If you would have been like, I mean, El Chapo, he's not a good guy at all, but he was building soccer stadiums for people. He was keeping his people happy, so they wouldn't obviously look into all the other stuff that he was doing. But I mean, whether it's a trick or not, it's a dangerous slope where you start questioning. I mean, if we didn't have this idea of demonizing or, hating the mob as a devil myth, and you realize, like, we mentioned talking about the government working with the mob. I mean, half the time you didn't even know where the government started and the mob ended. There was a link there. And I mean, when it comes to Hoover not acknowledging them, Anthony Summers is the one that found the photo and did all that and said, and I think there's an interview with one of the mob family members where he talks about we had pictures of him in a dress. I don't think that's necessarily the reason. I think it's also because if you look at Hoover liked to bet at the track and the mob owned the track, they fixed races for him. So why would you acknowledge that? I mean, if you're up to making a lot of money, I mean, it makes your life easier if you don't acknowledge the people. You don't want to screw over the mob. And when you're working with them, whether it's acts of covert action or things of that sort, you eventually you get profiles on the guys just to make sure you have blackmail over them. But the mob also had blackmail over on plenty of the government actions too. It was just like a really bad dysfunctional relationship. And it was like someone
Yeah,
should have got
because
a
I mean,
divorce
Hoover
at a
went
certain point.
every summer he was in La Jolla at the races, wasn't he? And and Palm Springs he used to go to too, which was very much the big. I always liked the idea that the whole Palm Springs area when all the mob went there to get a bit of a tan and get some hot weather or warm weather. That there was this no shooting. Nobody could shoot anybody else in Palm Springs County. That was the edict that went out. So it was, they're all on holiday, vacation time, no shooting. And the problem now, of course, is there are no primary evidence. You can't actually get Hoover in the seat in front of you and ask him, that day you went and bet and you lost $50,000 at the track. Who actually picked the tab up, or whatever it was, and that's the frustration. We've only got testimony, and a lot of the testimony is from people who were hoodlums or liars or cheats or whatever they were. So you're not quite sure. Unreliable narrators, possibly, is the phrase, for a lot of that kind of history. And as you say, what's the most fascinating thing has been the cover up of all of it over the years. I mean, it's the cover up is always what eventually brings people down. But of course, if you've done it in such a professional way, we're not quite sure what's behind the curtain. And I keep thinking there's the Wizard of Oz is there when you pull the curtain away, and who is this person or this entity? I suppose it's kind of a biblical in a way. You want to be there to be somebody, something to hang on to, and to pin everything on. But life's not, life, especially life of crime, is never that simple. It's everybody's running and ducking around corners and shutting the doors after themselves. So it's I like that image of people jumping in a bottle and pulling the cork in behind them and keeping it all locked away.
That's one thing that the FBI did was they got a PR team to make this God myth of Hoover, that he was this good Boy Scout purist type. Well, the public eventually created, I mean, not soon after that, was the devil myth to counteract the good PR system the FBI was doing to make Hoover look good. I mean, when you mentioned Margaret Thatcher and a movie being made about her that didn't come out until like 30 years later, I mean, Hoover was on set of his documentary being made. He was making sure that he had complete 100% insight onto what was going to happen. No hot dogs on set, for the love of God. Like, he would have killed somebody. But there was like, no, all jokes aside, he was influential into the way that they were documenting the FBI. And you kind of realize, like, I mean, movies have such an impact, but now I started to realize there's such an intersection with politics, and not only politics, but also, I mean, it's a complete mirror to our everyday life. We see, I mean, it's sad to me that the only things that get mentioned about Marilyn Monroe now, besides her being beautiful, is just factors of she was killed by the Kennedys, or there's a bunch of, and it's like, look, I have no clue. I'm not going to fight any fight on that. I think it's interesting for sure, but what about the career life that they led as well too? I mean, Frank Sinatra is a highly popular singer that everyone loves his songs, but then there's the gang involvement as well too that gets mentioned, which I think is interesting. But it's like, I mean, coming from a person like your standpoint, where you write biographies about these actors as well too, Clint Eastwood and other figures. I mean, there's always some type of scandal that gets involved in there, but to me, it's just like, why are we so taken back? Like, that's the only thing that we can remember about them. You know what I mean? Like, Clint Eastwood's very, very popular, but if Clint Eastwood had a giant scandal about it, would it just be his scandal that would be well known?
Yeah, I suppose it depends on the level of the scandal. Yeah, take Polanski. Um, the
Roman Polanski?
What you have to get over is the sexual assault of a 13-year-old girl in a hot tub in California, 19 whatever it was, 77, I think. But because he makes such wonderful films and so on, he's sort of forgiven for that. But there's a moral question there, and it's very, very difficult to get past that for most people, I think. So is Polanski remembered for all his movies? Yes, but that memory is definitely tainted by the sexual assault of an underage girl. It's and again, you look at that, it's even more complicated. You've got the Sharon Tate, his wife is murdered by the Manson family. It takes you into a whole realm of, and he was a Holocaust survivor. It's the more you go into it, you think, oh well, maybe he had he was mentally imbalanced. There was something. A lot of it's it's very hard. I mean, I sat next to Polanski during his hearing in Santa Monica Court before he did a runner and ran off to Paris, and he's a nice, affable guy. I was a young guy then. Maybe you just don't quite take in the enormity of what he'd done and what he was accused of, possibly. But now looking back, when you had children yourself and daughter and so on, you think, ooh, that really wasn't, you know. So it's difficult. It's to portray people. It's warts and all. Do you just remember the warts, or do you remember the achievements? It's a difficult question, because everybody makes mistakes, but not everybody makes these such hideous mistakes, really.
Well, it's like a double-edged sword. Is you if we blame society, in which most cases I think that society needs to catch up to the fact that a professional side of people is not like their personal side. Like, I've seen videos of Kennedy on the phone talking about chairs that were bought, and the general's on the phone. He's like, "Did someone buy those chairs?" And then the general's like, "Yeah," and he goes, and they had it on television. Those are $5,000 chairs a piece. And the guy goes, yeah. And he goes, it's a major fuck up. He says that on a recording. And I'm like, that does not match the Kennedy that have given all those great speeches and things of that sort. And I'm like, when you're so taken back because we're so cut off, we have like a very picture clean, censor code offist version. And you see this with the evolution of film. I mean, back in the day, you could not show sex on screen. If anything, I think they got closest was one foot had to be on the floor. And if it was going to be a scene of lovemaking, they'd point to the window and there'd be rain out on it, or they point to the fireplace. There was ways to avoid that. And now we've broken that censor. There has been heads getting chopped off on screen. There's as much, there's like 10 sums on screen sometimes, depending on what films you get. Sometimes you have to go behind a beaded curtain. But there's a lot of things that have kind of pushed us into an age of like now where it's more acceptable, where I still get to this point of like the Christian ideology with being a president and a family man and all these types of things. I'm like, we know what like not everybody believes that, but we still accept it as like that's the professional aspect of things, where I feel like it's a society issue where maybe it forced a lot of these people to feel suppressed actors and they got pushed to this point of doing that. But also maybe it was a fact of displaying an image that they knew the public wanted or accepted, the Superman character, and it's like, well, Superman has kryptonite, Superman he's not 100% good all the time. And I think that's why there's always like stories about Tom Cruise yelling at someone that was setting up a prop table or something. And people go, he's not really a nice guy. I'm like, well, you also got to realize the pressure that comes with an actor as well, too. It doesn't make some things acceptable. It just kind of displays this image where it's like these are human beings.
Explains them, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That makes sense.
No, again, it's what as you say, where it goes wrong is when there is a cover up of that, of if there are crimes or mistakes or errors made, and they're trying to cover them up. That's the bigger sin, I think. And back to rehabilitation of character is when people actually do admit the mistakes and do whatever penury they have to do to atone for it. But the modern world tends to not ask too much of kind of they're more forgiving, I think, now in certain cases, and far more vicious when they want to be as well. There's no gray areas. There's a very lack of gray now. It's very much white or black when it comes to making a decision whether someone is on good or bad.
Do you think when it comes to like all your work, at least looking into Hollywood, did you have a different perspective? Like, do you feel like you understand it better when it comes to how real it kind of is? Like, going into it, you probably didn't understand all the underworld connections, or maybe you did. That might have got you a little bit interested into it. But I've kind of had this child version of Hollywood where I go, oh yeah, movies are made by people with just great creativity. And then I start going in there and realizing, oh no, the DOD buys up scripts today. The CIA influences movies. The FBI does. The mob does. There's people and there's so much where I'm like, dang, I was like, man, what if I tried to make a movie? I was like, why don't you want to incorporate all this stuff in there? I submitted it in, and next thing you know, you get a letter back saying, yeah, we're not doing that. You can't put that in a film. And I'm like, why? It's my creative talent.
Yeah, I mean, the CIA are certainly very big, loads and loads of films, CIA approved scripts, and the CIA help. Well, not so much approving scripts. They accommodate filmmakers and help them with locations, with filming inside headquarters, with and in return for that, they be the CIA agents. And the organization is made to look very very positive and very very glowing. And I think that's the deal. It's back to what I say about Randolph Hearst and his World War I movies. They were patriotic, but it was propaganda, patriotic propaganda that he was whacking out. And I don't think there's anything different today. You look at all the some incredible films made. John Huston, Ford, various people during World War II. I mean, they were propaganda movies, but they made they were movies as well, and all of that kind of stuff. But that was all influence, and influence. It used to be subliminal, most of it, and a lot of it now is very in your face. They don't. There's no room on the internet. If you've got, if a book's the size of a postage stamp, the image of it on Amazon, or the soundbite, if it's not interesting, you're going to move on to the next one. All of that, it's got to be. There's no room for subtlety. It really is a big hammer and hammer the message home. And that is, I think, kind of the battle lines, the social battle lines have been kind of cut in half. It's a pretty clear line.
Do you know how much?
As I say, that grey area is gone, and of course, the grey area was where you had a chance to change your mind, change your opinion on something or somebody. And now you've actually got to think. You kind of not got to, but you're pressured to have one view about people and about society and about projects, be it films or political manifestos. You've got to think one way or another, but most things are not as clear cut as that. And that's kind of how we've kept democracy going, and people have different opinions. It's just a bit too left and right now. It's not so flexible. Society is less flexible, I think. And that's whereas with the Hollywood of the past, they kind of the movies went with the flow. And you can see the way film changed. You can watch them, and you can see the influences. If you look at the Roaring Twenties gangster movies, the bad guys definitely were bad guys. And if you look at the later on, as you said, there is an ambivalence about who's good, who's bad, who's an anti-hero, and who's a hero. Back to Lucky Luciano, he's a great example of it. One minute he's biggest gangster in America, and the second he's a World War II hero helping save America from the terrible Nazi threat. It's kind of
bit of a 180.
Yeah.
I would pay any amount of money to see Woody Harrelson's dad in a JFK movie on that knoll. I would pay all the money in the world to see that movie be made. That would be fantastic. It's never going to happen, but come on. I don't know why he said it, but it cheers me up every time I hear that.
Yeah, just all you got to do is write the scripts, get the talent, package it together, get the CIA approve it, you'll be fine.
Yeah, that's definitely going to be rejected. But Mr. Thompson, I appreciate the time you gave me to talk on my show. I really enjoyed this conversation. Is there a place where people can find your links, to any of your books, any websites, anything you'd like to promote, Twitter handle or anything?
No, just DougieThompson.com. DOUGIE Thompson THOMPSON.com.
Okay. Well, I'm going to link all that in the description, and any other links I find to any of your Amazon books or anything like that. I'm going to make sure.
They're all Amazon linked. That's right. Yeah.
And I'll put those all in the description. It's been a pleasure chatting, and thanks for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank.